Before the roar of engines tore the sky, before the earth shuddered and the very soul of man was irrevocably wounded, there were other sounds. The world of Yanis Papachistou, in the early honeyed summer of 1974, was a delicate symphony of gentle noises. It was the scrape of chalk against a worn blackboard, the rustle of turning pages in young hands, the bright, cascading laughter of children chasing each other under the shade of ancient olive trees in the schoolyard. It was the distant, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the soft cooing of the doves that nested in the eaves of the village church. Above all, it was his own voice, calm and measured, weaving tales of Socratic wisdom and the timeless virtues, arete, sophrosine, dikaiosine, for the rapt faces of his students, planting seeds of reason in fertile young minds. Yanis was more than a teacher. He was a custodian of ideals on an island where the whispers of conflict were growing steadily, ominously louder. In his small, sun-drenched classroom in a sleepy Cypriot village, he waged a quiet, daily war against the encroaching shadows of hatred. He taught his pupils not just the alphabet and arithmetic, but the profound absurdity of prejudice, the quiet strength found in empathy, and the fragile beauty of coexistence. His blackboard was a sanctuary, a slate where the future could be written in the clean, hopeful lines of chalk. The most common word written there, in elegant Greek letters, was elpida, hope. His own world was a microcosm of this peaceful philosophy. His wife, Eleni, a woman with kindness etched in the corners of her eyes, tended their garden, where the scent of jasmine and ripening lemons hung heavy in the warm air. Their 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, a whirlwind of dark curls and boundless curiosity, was the living embodiment of the future Yanis fought to protect. She was the reason he believed so fiercely in his mission. For her, he would build a world where the only borders were the covers of a book, and the only battles were those of wits and intellect. The evenings were his sanctuary within a sanctuary. The simple meal of bread, olives, and cheese, the shared stories on their small stone patio as the cicadas sang their nightly chorus. Sophia, asleep in his arms, her small chest rising and falling in the trusting rhythm of innocence, a rhythm he believed was the true heartbeat of the world. But the island was sick with a fever that no amount of reason could cool. The political tensions that had simmered for years were beginning to boil over. The broadcasts on the radio, once filled with traditional music and local news, were now dominated by the harsh, clipped tones of politicians spitting venom, their words dripping with nationalism and division. Trust, the invisible thread that held the village together, began to fray. Lifelong neighbors, Greek and Turkish Cypriots, who had shared weddings and funerals, who had borrowed sugar and watched each other's children grow up, now exchanged wary glances over their garden walls. A shadow was falling, long and cold, and though Yanis kept writing hope on his blackboard, he could feel the foundations of his world trembling beneath his feet. He could see the hairline fractures of fear appearing in the solid bedrock of his community.
One morning, the symphony was shattered. The children's laughter was not replaced but devoured by a sound that did not belong. It was a monstrous, metallic shriek that ripped through the placid blue sky. Fighter jets, silver predators against the azure canvas tore overhead, their sonic booms shaking the very stones of the schoolhouse and rattling the teeth in one's head. It was a sound that broke more than the sound barrier. It shattered the fragile bubble of peace Yanis had so carefully constructed. In that moment, he saw the future he had been writing on the blackboard being violently erased by an invisible, brutal hand. This, however, was only the overture. The true cacophony of horror had yet to begin. When war descends upon a village, it does not arrive with a declaration. It arrives as chaos, a thief of logic and a murderer of reason. Yanis's first instinct was not to fight, but to shield. He gathered the terrified children into the main schoolroom, his voice a strained beacon of calm in a sea of rising panic. He tried to lead them in a song, a familiar folk tune about shepherds and stars, but their small voices were thin and reedy, drowned out by the percussive, terrifying rhythm of distant explosions that drew nearer with each passing minute. He looked into their wide, frightened eyes and saw his own terror reflected back at him. A terror he had to suppress for their sake, locking it behind a facade of teacherly authority. Soon, the school was no longer a sanctuary, but a potential target. The village had become a front line. Yanis, his heart a cold stone in his chest, ran through the dusty, deserted streets to his home, grabbing Eleni and a sleeping Sophia. They descended into the darkness of the cellar, a small, musty space meant for storing wine and olives, now to be their world. The heavy wooden door closed them in, muffling the sounds of the escalating battle outside, but amplifying the sounds of their own fear, their ragged breaths, Eleni's stifled sobs, the frantic, terrifying beating of his own heart against his ribs. Days bled into nights in that subterranean prison. Time became a formless, terrifying expanse measured only by the intensity of the gunfire outside and the growing pangs of hunger in their stomachs. The ideals Yanis had cherished, the philosophical pillars that had supported his entire existence, began to crumble in the damp, oppressive darkness. Peace, he realized with a sickening clarity, was a luxury, a concept that could not survive without food, water, and safety. Hope, the word he had written so many times, now seemed like a cruel, meaningless joke. It was a word for a world of light, and they were creatures of the dark now. He would hold Sophia, telling her stories of brave heroes and magical lands, but his voice would falter. How could he speak of justice when the world outside was ruled by the law of the gun? How could he talk of virtue when survival was becoming the only moral imperative? He felt his identity, the very essence of the man he was, dissolving like salt in water. The teacher was dying, and in his place a more primal being was being born, one animated by the singular, desperate need to protect his family. The true breaking point came when their last canteen of water was empty and the final piece of stale bread was gone. Sophia's whimpers of thirst were a physical pain in his chest, more agonizing than any wound. He knew they could not stay. He knew he had to go outside.
Before he unlatched the door, his eyes fell upon it. Hanging on 2 iron hooks on the cellar wall was his father's old hunting rifle. It had been there for decades, a dormant relic of a past he had never embraced. He had always seen it as a symbol of crude violence, a stark contrast to his world of words and ideas. Now, as he reached for it, his hands trembling, the cold, heavy steel felt like both a sacrilege and a sacrament. As his fingers, a teacher's fingers, accustomed to the soft dust of chalk, wrapped around the wooden stock, he felt a profound and irreversible shift within himself. He was crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. The weight of the gun in his hands was the weight of a soul being surrendered. He was no longer just Yanis the teacher. He was Yanis, the father, the protector, and he was armed. He thought there might be supplies in the house of a neighbor who he knew had fled at the first sign of trouble. Moving under the cloak of a moonless night, he slipped out of the cellar. The village he knew was gone. In its place was a skeletal ruin, a ghost town haunted by the specter of violence. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. Every crunch of debris under his feet was a gunshot in the deafening silence. This was a hostile, alien landscape, and he was a trespasser in the ruins of his own life. It was then that he heard it, a sound that froze the blood in his veins. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and moving unmistakably toward his own house, toward the cellar where his wife and daughter were hiding. It was a sound that would change everything. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He scrambled back to the cellar, his heart hammering against his ribs. He slipped inside, bolting the door just as Eleni looked at him, her face a mask of pure terror. She pointed a trembling finger toward the door. The footsteps were right outside now. Then came a new sound, the splintering of wood as someone tried to pry the door open. Yanis raised the rifle. The world narrowed to the small metal sight at the end of the barrel. His mind was a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts. The faces of his students filled with trust and admiration, and then a tiny, terrified whisper from the darkness behind him. "Papa, I'm scared." Sophia's voice. It was the fulcrum on which his world turned. The cellar door creaked open, a sliver of gray pre-dawn light cutting through the darkness. A silhouette appeared, stooped and holding a crowbar. For a heartbeat, Yanis's mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. This was not a soldier, it was not a stranger, it was Andreas, his neighbor from across the street. Andreas, with whom he had shared countless cups of coffee, whose children played with Sophia. Perhaps he was searching for food for his own family. Perhaps he had joined one of the armed militias. In that singular, eternal moment, it didn't matter. Andreas had seen them, and in the brutal new language of this war, to be seen was to be a liability. To be discovered was to be condemned. The eyes of the two neighbors met across the chasm of what their world had become. Yanis saw not malice in Andreas's face, but the same desperate fear that clawed at his own insides. A lifetime of shared greetings, of mundane kindnesses, flashed before Yanis's eyes. This was Andreas, a man, a father, a neighbor. The teacher in him screamed, "No!" But behind him, Sophia let out a small, involuntary cry. Andreas's head snapped toward the sound. In his eyes, a flicker of comprehension, of calculation. In that flicker, Yanis saw not a neighbor, but a threat to his child. The primal instinct, the one that had been born in the darkness of the cellar, took complete control. The teacher's mind, which saw nuance and complexity, went silent. The father's mind, which saw only his daughter's face, saw a simple, terrible equation. Sophia's voice, it was the sound that tipped the scales of his soul into hell. The explosion of the rifle was deafening in the confined space. The world dissolved into a flash of light and a cloud of acrid smoke. In the ringing silence that followed, Janis understood a terrible truth. 2 men had died in the cellar that morning. One was Andreas. The other was the teacher named Janis Papachristou. The man who survived, the man who shakily lowered the rifle as his wife stared at him in silent, horrified disbelief, was a stranger. He had saved his family, but he had murdered his own soul to do it. The war ended. The guns fell silent. The politicians eventually signed papers. But for Janis, the war never ended. The battlefield simply moved inside, to the quiet, desolate landscape of his memory. He and his family survived. They escaped. They became refugees, and eventually they tried to rebuild. But the man who had taught children about hope was now a hollow echo of himself. He never returned to a classroom. How could he? How could he stand before a new generation of children and speak of virtue and peace when his own hands felt so irredeemably stained? How could he write hope on a blackboard when the word now tasted like ash and gunpowder in his mouth? The sight of chalk would make his hands tremble. The sound of a child's laughter would sometimes bring tears to his eyes, tears for a world he had lost and an innocence he had personally executed. Years later, an old man with haunted eyes would sometimes sit alone, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. They were the hands of a killer and the hands of a savior, and he could no longer tell them apart. He had won the most important battle of his life. He had saved his daughter, but in doing so, he had lost the war for his own humanity. The greatest tragedy of war is not always in the bodies it leaves behind on the battlefield. It is in the souls it hollows out, the spirits it leaves to wander the earth, alive but never truly living again. Janis was a survivor, but he would spend the rest of his life wondering if what he had saved was worth what he had lost. It was a question to which he would never find an answer, whispered endlessly in the profound, unending silence that followed the echo of a single gunshot.